The prestige and pressure of La Finesse. Peter Marshall stood in front of the grand windows of La Finesse, his upscale restaurant, gazing at the bustling streets of the city. His pride swelled every time he thought about what he had built, a culinary paradise that attracted the city's elite. The chandeliers sparkled with delicate crystals, reflecting the warm glow of candlelight, while each table was adorned with expensive porcelain and fine glassware. From the elegant marble flooring to the exclusive art pieces hung on the walls, everything about La Finesse screamed sophistication and success. But today, something was different. Peter's mood had been soured by a series of unfortunate events. Several of his wealthiest patrons had canceled their reservations without warning. The morning had brought nothing but problems. Personal reasons, family emergencies, or sudden travels, all excuses that felt like slaps to his pride. He had counted on these reservations to bring in the kind of revenue that kept La Finesse ahead of its competitors. Worse, the restaurant's once flawless operations were beginning to show signs of strain. To top it all off, the food deliveries were delayed, a situation that Peter considered nothing short of catastrophic. His chef, a man as meticulous as Peter himself, cast anxious glances at the refrigerator, which was dangerously close to empty. Peter's patience was wearing thin, and the tight knot of anxiety that had been growing in his chest all morning was now threatening to unravel his composure. He paced back and forth, his shoes clicking sharply against the polished floors, each step matching the pounding in his head. His pride as a restaurant owner was tethered to the image of perfection that La Finesse represented, and any hint of failure was unacceptable. His world, his reputation, his status in the elite social circles of the city, everything depended on his ability to maintain control. Peter had no time for incompetence, and the delay in food deliveries was the kind of negligence he could not tolerate. "Where is the supplier?" he barked at one of his employees, barely concealing his frustration. Do they not understand the importance of timeliness here? His staff, sensing his irritability, moved quietly, avoiding eye contact. No one dared to offer excuses or explanations. Everyone knew Peter's temper was on a short fuse today. The atmosphere in the restaurant was thick with tension, and every staff member was walking on eggshells, trying to avoid triggering Peter's wrath. And then, in the middle of the mounting pressure, the doors of the restaurant swung open. In walked a black man, dressed in plain work overalls. His presence was striking not because of his appearance, but because of how out of place he seemed amidst the refinement and luxury of La Finesse. He wasn't dressed in the fine suits of Peter's regular clientele. Instead, he looked like someone who belonged to the working class, a delivery man, perhaps, or a mechanic. His clothing was simple, his face calm, and his posture unassuming. But Peter, already on edge, took one look at the man and felt his anger flare. Without giving him a second thought, Peter's ingrained biases took over. He didn't care to know who the man was or why he was there. His frustration, combined with his unconscious prejudice, bubbled to the surface. Peter strode across the room, his face twisted in disdain. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the low hum of conversation from the patrons seated nearby. "This is La Finesse, not some place for vagrants." The insult hung in the air like a bitter cloud. Several customers turned their heads, their expressions shifting from amusement to discomfort. Some whispered to each other, while others watched silently, unsure of what would happen next. The man, Jonathan Carter, stood silently in the face of Peter's outburst. His expression remained neutral, though his eyes betrayed a quiet understanding of the situation. He had encountered men like Peter before, those who saw his skin color and immediately made assumptions about his worth, intelligence, or social standing. Jonathan had long since learned to let such insults roll off his back, but today something felt different. Today, there was an opportunity in the air. Peter, however, was blind to what was happening. His focus remained solely on venting his frustrations. "We don't need people like you wandering into places like this," Peter continued, his tone growing harsher. "Go back to where you came from." Jonathan remained calm, his posture dignified despite the verbal assault. He had a quiet strength about him, the kind that didn't need to shout to be heard. As Peter berated him, Jonathan thought about the irony of the situation, how this man, so full of arrogance, had no idea who he was speaking to. Jonathan was no ordinary man. He was, in fact, the main supplier for La Finesse, the one responsible for delivering the high-quality ingredients that Peter prided himself on. Without Jonathan, La Finesse would be nothing. Yet, Jonathan didn't feel the need to assert his power just yet. He had learned long ago that respect wasn't something to be demanded. It was something earned, and he had spent years building his reputation as a man of integrity and hard work. As Peter ranted, Jonathan simply waited. The staff around them exchanged uneasy glances, some lowering their eyes in embarrassment, others looking away entirely. Unlike Peter, they knew who Jonathan was. They knew that without him, the restaurant would be in serious trouble, but none of them dared to speak up, fearing Peter's temper. As the minutes ticked by, Peter's insults became more pointed. "What's the matter? Can't afford a real meal, so you thought you'd sneak in here?" He sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Let me guess, you're here for a handout." Jonathan held his ground, his silence speaking volumes. He could see that Peter was unraveling, his sense of superiority blinding him to the reality of the situation. The restaurant owner had no idea that he was on the verge of a major downfall, one that would shake the very foundations of his business. And Jonathan, with the calm patience of someone who had weathered many storms, knew that the time for reckoning was near. The brewing storm. Peter Marshall's arrogance was palpable as he continued his verbal tirade against Jonathan, blind to the eyes now watching him with increasing discomfort. He didn't notice the ripple of unease that had spread through the restaurant or the staff's growing anxiety. All he could see was a man who, in his mind, didn't belong in La Finesse, a man who represented everything Peter had been taught to look down upon. As Peter ranted, his voice grew louder, rising above the soft music and murmurs of the other diners. He was no longer just angry at the delayed food deliveries or the canceled reservations. Now he had found a convenient target for all his pent-up frustration. Jonathan, standing there in his modest work overalls, became the focus of Peter's misplaced rage. The staff at La Finesse knew better than to intervene. Peter was known for his short temper, especially on days when the restaurant wasn't running smoothly. They'd seen him lash out before, though never like this. This time felt different, more personal, more vindictive. And yet none of them had the courage to step in, even as they exchanged anxious glances behind Peter's back. Jonathan Carter remained standing in the same spot, his calm demeanor unshaken. He had seen this behavior before in other men who believed that wealth or status gave them the right to belittle others. He had faced prejudice in many forms, from subtle slights to outright insults, but he had learned long ago that reacting with anger never solved anything. Instead, he had always preferred to let his actions speak for him. Today, however, the stakes were higher, and he knew that remaining silent would soon shift the balance of power in a way that Peter could not foresee. The other patrons in the restaurant had begun to take notice of the escalating situation. Whispers spread from table to table as diners discreetly watched the scene unfold. Some seemed uncomfortable, while others appeared intrigued, as if they were witnessing some kind of unfolding drama. But no one spoke up. After all, this was La Finesse, a place where conflict was usually as refined as the food, subtle, and hidden behind layers of social etiquette. No one expected a confrontation like this, especially one involving the owner himself. Peter, however, was oblivious to the growing tension around him. He was too consumed by his own frustration to notice the way his employees were watching him or the way the atmosphere in the room had shifted. To him, Jonathan was nothing more than an annoyance, someone who had wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. And Peter, in his mind, was merely setting things right. "Do you even know where you are?" Peter spat, taking a step closer to Jonathan, his face contorted with disdain. "This is La Finesse. We serve the finest clientele, the wealthiest in the city, people with class, with taste, and you think you can just walk in here dressed like that?" He gestured dismissively at Jonathan's work overalls, as if the mere sight of them offended him. "You don't belong here." Jonathan's eyes flicked briefly around the room, noting the growing interest from the other diners. He could see the embarrassment on the faces of some, the discomfort on others, and the quiet horror in the eyes of Peter's staff. But still, he said nothing. Peter, misinterpreting Jonathan's silence as submission, sneered, "What's the matter? Nothing to say for yourself?" No clever retort. His voice dripped with mockery. "Or maybe you finally realized that this is no place for someone like you." At that moment, the chef of La Finesse, Chef Lucien, appeared from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. Lucien was a man of few words but impeccable skills, a perfectionist who had worked in some of the finest restaurants around the world before being recruited by Peter. He had earned Peter's respect, not just for his culinary expertise, but for his discipline and professionalism. However, today was different. Chef Lucien paused at the sight of Peter confronting Jonathan, his brow furrowed as he took in the scene. Peter's escalating anger, Jonathan's quiet calm, and the unease that had settled over the restaurant. Lucien, like the rest of the staff, knew exactly who Jonathan Carter was. In fact, Jonathan's company had been supplying La Finesse with its premium ingredients for years, and without his contributions, the restaurant's reputation for excellence would crumble. But Chef Lucien also knew Peter well enough to understand that trying to interrupt him in the middle of one of his tirades was a risky move. Peter was a man who hated to be contradicted, especially in front of others. So, like the rest of the staff, Lucien hesitated, unsure of how to intervene without making the situation worse. Peter, still oblivious to the growing tension, continued his attack. "You're lucky I don't have security throw you out," he snarled, his voice rising in volume. "This isn't some fast food joint you can just stroll into. This is an establishment of class and prestige." A few patrons had started to discreetly film the encounter on their phones, sensing that something significant was happening. Peter, wrapped up in his own arrogance, didn't notice the phones pointed in his direction. Jonathan, however, saw everything. He noticed the cameras, the growing murmurs among the diners, and the way the entire room seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then something inside Jonathan shifted. He had stood by long enough, allowing Peter to embarrass himself, allowing the man's prejudice and arrogance to fuel his own undoing. But now it was time for a reckoning. "Mr. Marshall," Jonathan finally spoke, his voice steady and calm, cutting through Peter's rant. His tone was not confrontational, but it carried an authority that instantly commanded attention. Peter stopped mid-sentence, caught off guard by Jonathan's sudden words. For a moment, the restaurant went completely silent, all eyes now fixed on the two men standing in the center of the room. Jonathan held Peter's gaze, his expression unreadable. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. There was no malice in his tone, only a quiet confidence. Peter blinked, momentarily thrown off by the question. "I don't care who you are," he snapped, though there was a note of uncertainty in his voice now. "You don't belong here." Jonathan nodded slowly, as if he had expected that response. "I see," he said softly. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "Perhaps you should care, Mr. Marshall, because without me, La Finesse wouldn't have the food it serves." Peter's eyes narrowed in confusion, the weight of Jonathan's words not yet fully sinking in. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, though there was now a flicker of doubt in his voice. Jonathan remained calm, his voice steady. "I am Jonathan Carter. My company supplies La Finesse with every single product you serve to your high-end clientele. Without my deliveries, this restaurant wouldn't last a week." The silence that followed was deafening. Peter's face drained of color as the full weight of Jonathan's words hit him. The realization dawned slowly, like a punch to the gut. He had just humiliated the very man who held his business in the palm of his hand. the man who controlled every ingredient that came through the doors of La Fenice, from the finest cuts of meat to the rarest spices. Jonathan didn't need to say anything more. The truth hung in the air between them, undeniable and inescapable. Peter had let his arrogance blind him to the reality of the situation, and now the consequences were about to unfold. As the patrons continued to watch in stunned silence, and the staff exchanged uneasy glances, Peter Marshall finally realized the gravity of his mistake. The price of arrogance. The quiet of La Fenice after Jonathan Carter's revelation was unlike anything the restaurant had ever experienced. The hum of conversation had ceased entirely, the clinking of glasses and the shuffling of silverware fading into an eerie silence. The entire room seemed suspended in time, with all eyes fixed on Peter Marshall and the man he had just insulted, Jonathan Carter, the supplier who had, for years, kept Peter's prized restaurant afloat. Peter stood frozen, his mind racing to catch up with the situation. His face, once flushed with anger, had now gone pale, and a cold sweat began to bead on his forehead. The weight of his actions crashed down on him all at once, suffocating him in a wave of panic. He had insulted the man responsible for delivering the lifeblood of his business, the finest ingredients, the rarest spices, the premium cuts of meat. All of it had come from Jonathan Carter's company, a fact Peter had been blissfully unaware of until now. For years, Peter had lived in a bubble of self-importance, confident that his restaurant's success was due solely to his meticulous management, his high standards, and his perfectionist eye for detail. But now, that bubble had burst, and it had burst publicly. Around them, the diners were still watching, some with phones discreetly filming, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding drama. A scandal of this magnitude in an upscale restaurant like La Fenice was rare, and the spectacle was too tempting for some to ignore. A few patrons had already begun sharing the footage on social media, captions forming like wildfire as the incident spread beyond the walls of the restaurant. The viral moment had begun, but Peter didn't know that yet. Jonathan Carter, however, remained calm. His posture was relaxed, his eyes steady on Peter, but beneath that calm exterior, Jonathan's mind was at work. He could see the fear beginning to creep into Peter's expression, the dawning horror of what he had just done. And though Jonathan had every right to be angry, to retaliate, he had not built his life or his reputation on pettiness or vengeance. He had been raised to value integrity, to understand the power of restraint. And in this moment, that restraint was what set him apart from Peter. Peter, however, was struggling to maintain any semblance of composure. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. I didn't realize," he stammered, his voice weak, a far cry from the commanding tone he had used just moments ago. Jonathan tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "No," he said quietly, "you didn't. You didn't realize who I was, and you didn't care to find out. You judged me based on how I looked, not on who I am or what I've done." Peter's heart pounded in his chest, and the truth of Jonathan's words hit him like a sledgehammer. He had always prided himself on running La Fenice as a place of excellence, where only the best could enter. But in doing so, he had allowed his prejudices to dictate his actions, never questioning his assumptions about the people around him. The diners continued to watch in silence, some leaning in closer, while others whispered to each other in hushed tones. Many had never seen Peter so vulnerable, so exposed. He had always been the image of control, the sharp-eyed restaurateur who demanded nothing but perfection. But now, that control was slipping away, unraveling in front of everyone. Peter's mind raced with thoughts of damage control. How could he salvage this? How could he possibly undo what he had just done? The realization that this moment could ruin him began to sink in. La Fenice had always been a symbol of prestige, a place where the wealthy and powerful dined, but it also depended on reputation. And in an age where reputations could be destroyed with the click of a button, Peter knew he was dangerously close to the edge. He needed to fix this, and he needed to fix it now. "Mr. Carter," Peter said, his voice shaking with desperation. I didn't mean." But before he could finish, Jonathan held up a hand, silencing him. "I'm not interested in your excuses, Mr. Marshall," Jonathan said evenly. "I've heard them all before. The truth is, your words revealed exactly what you think of people like me. You didn't see a person when you looked at me. You saw someone you could dismiss. Someone beneath you." Peter flinched at the harsh truth in Jonathan's words. His arrogance had been laid bare for everyone to see, and there was no taking it back. The diners around them, who had once seen Peter as a figure of sophistication, now saw him for what he was. Flawed, deeply so. But the humiliation wasn't over. The viral video was already spreading like wildfire across social media, with thousands of viewers now watching the encounter unfold in real time. Peter had no idea that his reputation wasn't just at risk within the walls of La Finesse, but beyond them as well. His name, his face, and his words were being shared, commented on, and scrutinized by an audience far larger than the one in his restaurant. As the weight of the situation settled on Peter's shoulders, a new figure appeared at the entrance to the restaurant, a well-dressed man in a tailored suit, his presence commanding attention as he strode toward the front of the dining area. His eyes scanned the room, landing first on Peter, then on Jonathan, and finally on the staff members who were hovering nervously in the background. This man was Derek Langston, a powerful and well-known attorney in the city, as well as one of Jonathan Carter's closest friends. He had heard about the confrontation through a friend dining at the restaurant, and now, with the situation quickly spiraling out of control, he had arrived to lend his support. Peter recognized Derek immediately, and his heart sank even further. Derek wasn't just any lawyer. He was a man with influence, connections, and a reputation for defending those who had been wronged. If Derek got involved, Peter's situation could become even worse. The thought of a lawsuit, or worse, a public trial, flashed through his mind, and panic gripped him. Derek approached Jonathan with a nod of respect. "I came as soon as I heard," he said quietly, his voice calm but authoritative. He glanced at Peter, then back at Jonathan. "Is everything all right here?" Jonathan smiled faintly, his composure unwavering. "Everything is under control, Derek. Just a misunderstanding." Peter opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, judging him, condemning him. His arrogance, his prejudice had led him here, and now he was trapped in a situation of his own making. Jonathan turned to Peter one last time. "Mr. Marshall, I've always believed in second chances. People can change if they're willing to learn. But I also believe in accountability. You've built your business on the assumption that people like me don't matter. That ends today." Peter felt his legs tremble as Jonathan's words echoed in his mind. The consequences of his actions had begun to set in, and the path forward was uncertain. Jonathan gave a small nod to Derek, signaling that they were leaving. But before they could, a voice from one of the tables spoke up. It was one of the restaurant's regular patrons, a wealthy businessman who had been watching the scene unfold. "Wait," the man said, standing up from his table. "You can't just leave. Peter owes you an apology, and he owes us one too." The room fell into an even deeper silence as the businessman's words hung in the air. Peter, now visibly shaken, looked at the man, then at the other patrons, who were nodding in agreement. They, too, had seen the truth of Peter's character, and they weren't going to let him off the hook. Peter's mouth went dry. He was cornered, with no way out. Jonathan, ever calm, glanced at Peter one last time. "The choice is yours, Mr. Marshall," he said quietly. "What kind of man do you want to be?" The weight of accountability. The question Jonathan left hanging in the air echoed through Peter Marshall's mind like a relentless drumbeat. What kind of man do you want to be? For the first time in years, Peter was forced to confront his own reflection, stripped of the prestige, the wealth, and the power he had cloaked himself in. In that moment, standing under the intense gaze of his patrons, his staff, And most importantly, Jonathan Carter. He felt utterly exposed. La Finis had been his fortress, a place where he was king. But now, that fortress felt more like a cage. His arrogance, his prejudice, his unchecked anger had all led him to this precipice, and the decision before him was clear: continue down the path of denial and arrogance, or face the consequences of his actions with humility. Peter's throat tightened as he looked around the room. The regulars, people he had always assumed admired him, were watching him with expressions that ranged from disappointment to disgust. They had seen the real him today, and no amount of fine dining or five-star service could erase what had unfolded here. Even his own staff, the people he relied on to keep his empire running, had avoided meeting his eyes. Their loyalty to him, once unwavering, now seemed precarious at best. Jonathan Carter and Derek Langston stood near the entrance, ready to leave, but they lingered, giving Peter a chance to redeem himself or dig his grave deeper. The wealthy businessman who had spoken up earlier was still standing, waiting for Peter's response. His expression was stern, his arms crossed, and his posture one of authority. Peter had known this man for years, Charles Whitmore, a prominent investor who dined at La Finis regularly and whose connections in the business world were invaluable. Losing someone like Charles would be a blow Peter's reputation might never recover from. Charles's words rang clear: "Peter owes you an apology, and he owes us one too." Peter swallowed hard. Apologizing was not something that came easily to him. He had spent so many years cultivating an image of strength and superiority that the thought of admitting fault felt like an admission of weakness. But the truth was staring him in the face. He had humiliated a man in front of his peers, judged him solely on his appearance, and nearly destroyed the very foundation of his business out of sheer ignorance and pride. Peter took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every eye in the room on him. The silence was oppressive, and his heart raced as the moment stretched out. He couldn't afford to hesitate any longer. Every second that passed felt like another step toward his inevitable downfall. Peter's voice cracked, and he cleared his throat, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. "I made a mistake." The words felt foreign on his tongue, but he forced himself to continue. "Mr. Carter," Peter said, turning to Jonathan, his voice strained but sincere, I am deeply sorry for the way I treated you. I was wrong." Jonathan's expression remained calm, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Perhaps surprise, perhaps curiosity. He remained silent, giving Peter the space to continue. "I let my frustration and my prejudices cloud my judgment," Peter admitted, his voice trembling with the weight of the confession. "I judged you without knowing who you were, without even caring to know. And that's not who I want to be. I know words alone can't undo what I've done, but I hope you can forgive me." Jonathan remained quiet for a moment, studying Peter with a gaze that seemed to pierce right through him. The entire restaurant was still, everyone waiting for what would happen next. After what felt like an eternity, Jonathan nodded slowly. "Apologies are a start," he said, his voice steady, "but they're only meaningful if they're followed by real change." Peter nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He knew that Jonathan was right. This wasn't just about saying sorry and moving on. If he wanted to save his business and his reputation, he would have to prove that he was willing to change, that he was capable of learning from his mistakes. The patrons began to murmur softly, their eyes shifting between Peter and Jonathan. The tension in the room was still thick, but there was a sense that the worst of the storm had passed. Peter had taken the first step, but it was clear that his journey toward redemption was far from over. However, the ripple effects of his actions were only just beginning to unfold. At that moment, a waitress hurried over to Peter, her face pale and anxious as she handed him her phone. "Sir," she whispered urgently, "you need to see this." Peter took the phone with a frown, glancing down at the screen. His stomach dropped as he saw what was playing. There on the screen was a video of his confrontation with Jonathan, filmed from multiple angles by the patrons in the restaurant. The video had already been uploaded to social media, and it was spreading like wildfire. Hundreds of comments were pouring in, most of them condemning Peter's behavior. "I can't believe this man owns La Finesse. Shameful behavior from someone who claims to run a place of class. Good for Jonathan Carter for keeping his cool. What a horrible person Peter Marshall is." Peter's hands began to tremble as he scrolled through the comments. The footage was damning. Every word of his insult, every moment of his arrogance had been captured and broadcast for the world to see. His face, once the proud symbol of La Finesse's success, was now synonymous with scandal. Peter stammered, looking up from the phone, his face ashen. "The video. It's everywhere." Jonathan gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable. "The world is watching now, Peter. What you do next will define not just your business, but who you are as a person." Peter felt the full weight of those words settle over him. His mind raced as he tried to comprehend the consequences. His reputation, his livelihood. Everything was on the line. The video would reach not only his patrons but investors, food critics, and the wider public. His name, which had once been synonymous with luxury and prestige, was now trending for all the wrong reasons. Charles Whitmore, the wealthy businessman, cleared his throat, drawing Peter's attention back to him. "Peter," he said, his voice firm, "I'm not the only one in this room who is deeply disappointed in what we've seen today. We came here expecting the finest dining experience, but instead, we witnessed something that has no place in civilized society." Peter felt his heart sink further. He knew where this was going. "I've supported your restaurant for years," Charles continued, "but if this is the kind of behavior you allow yourself to indulge in, I'll have no choice but to withdraw my support. And I'm certain I'm not the only one who feels this way." Several other patrons nodded in agreement, their faces stern. Peter's mouth went dry. Losing Charles's support would be devastating, not just because of his personal patronage, but because of the influence he wielded in the city's business community. If Charles walked away, others would follow. La Finesse would be crippled, perhaps beyond repair. Desperation clawed at Peter's throat. "Please," he said, his voice hoarse, "give me a chance to make this right." Charles raised an eyebrow, his expression hard. "And how do you propose to do that, Peter? A simple apology isn't enough. You've exposed something far deeper than a bad temper. You've shown us who you really are." Peter's mind raced, searching for a solution, a way to salvage the situation. "I'll make changes," he said quickly. "Real changes, starting now. I'll overhaul our staff training, bring in diversity and inclusion consultants. I'll do whatever it takes." Charles crossed his arms, clearly unconvinced. "Talk is cheap, Peter. It's your actions that will determine whether La Finesse survives this." Jonathan, who had been quietly observing the exchange, finally spoke up. "Mr. Whitmore is right," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You need to show that you're serious about change, not just for your sake, but for the sake of everyone who works here. This restaurant isn't just about you. It's about the people who make it what it is. Your staff, your suppliers, your patrons. If you want to rebuild trust, you'll need to start by rebuilding those relationships." Peter nodded, his mind spinning with the gravity of the task ahead. This was no longer just about saving face. This was about rebuilding everything from the ground up. He had a long road ahead, and it would require more than just words. It would require humility, effort, and a complete shift in how he approached both his business and his life. As Jonathan and Derek turned to leave, Peter called after them, his voice shaking but resolute. "Mr. Carter, thank you. I promise I'll make things right." Jonathan paused at the door, glancing back at Peter with a measured look. "I hope you do, Mr. Marshall, for your sake and for theirs." With that, Jonathan and Derek walked out of the restaurant, leaving Peter standing in the middle of the dining room, surrounded by the remnants of his arrogance and the shattered pieces of his reputation, rebuilding from the ashes. The door of La Finesse swung shut behind Jonathan Carter and Derek Langston, and the sound seemed to echo in Peter Marshall's mind. He stood there, his back rigid, eyes staring at the exit, as if he was still trying to process everything that had just unfolded. The air inside the restaurant felt thick, heavy with unspoken judgments, silent condemnation, and the overwhelming reality that nothing would ever be the same again. The patrons, who had once been the source of Peter's pride, people who had respected and admired him, were now staring at him with a mixture of disappointment and disdain. Many of them had begun to pack up their things, preparing to leave the restaurant without finishing their meals. The experience had been tainted, the allure of La Finesse tarnished by the very man who had built it. Peter swallowed hard, guilt gnawing at him. Maria. She held up a hand to stop him. I don't want excuses, Peter. You can't talk your way out of this. You crossed a line, and you need to understand that what you did today wasn't just about you losing your temper. It was about how you see people, how you treat them. Peter's throat tightened. He had never seen Maria like this before, so direct, so unflinchingly honest. But he knew she was right. Everything she was saying cut to the core of the problem. I know, Peter admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I know I messed up, but I don't know how to fix this. Maria looked at him for a long moment, her eyes softening slightly. You need to start by making amends, not just to Jonathan, but to everyone you've let down. That includes your staff. We've stood by you through everything, but this is different. We need to know that you're willing to change, that you're not just paying lip service to the idea of being better. Peter nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. He had taken his staff for granted, assuming that their loyalty would be unwavering no matter what. But now he could see the cracks forming in that loyalty, and he realized just how fragile his position truly was. You're right, Peter said, his voice steadier now. I need to do more than just apologize. I need to show that I'm serious about changing. Maria studied him for a moment, as if gauging whether he truly meant what he was saying. Finally, she gave a small nod. Good, because you're going to need all the help you can get. Peter felt a flicker of hope at her words, but it was tempered by the enormity of the task ahead. He knew that his public apology was only the first step in a long and difficult journey. But for the first time in hours, he felt a small sense of direction, an understanding that, while the road ahead would be rough, it wasn't entirely impassable. With Maria's help, Peter sat down to draft a statement that would be shared across all platforms, a heartfelt apology, not only to Jonathan Carter but to his staff, his patrons, and the entire community. He knew it had to be more than just empty words. He would commit to real changes within the restaurant, starting with hiring diversity consultants to educate both himself and his team. Training programs would be implemented, and a portion of the restaurant's profits would be donated to organizations that fought against the very prejudices Peter had displayed. By the time the statement was ready to be posted, it was nearing midnight, and the restaurant had long since emptied. The lights were dim, and the silence was heavy, but Peter could feel the gravity of the moment as he hit publish on the apology. The response was immediate. Comments poured in, some supportive, others still outraged. It was clear that trust wouldn't be rebuilt overnight. But the fact that Peter had taken the first step toward accountability did not go unnoticed. Influencers who had condemned him earlier acknowledged the effort, and some even encouraged others to give La Finesse another chance, if, and only if, Peter followed through on his promises. As Peter sat alone in the empty restaurant, scrolling through the comments, he knew that this was just the beginning. The hardest part was yet to come, but for the first time in a long time, he felt the faintest glimmer of hope. The road to redemption would be long and painful, but if he was willing to face it head-on, maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild not just his business, but himself. The road to redemption. Weeks passed since Peter Marshall's public apology had been posted. Though the immediate storm of outrage had subsided, the aftermath of his actions lingered like a dark cloud over La Finesse. The restaurant, once the epitome of high-class dining, was now fighting for its reputation. The seats that used to be filled with the city's elite were now conspicuously empty on many nights. Reservations had plummeted, and the staff could feel the change in the air, a nervous tension, a sense of uncertainty that hovered over everything they did. But Peter had made a promise to change, and he was determined to keep it. It hadn't been easy. After the apology went live, La Finesse received a flood of both support and criticism. Some patrons appreciated Peter's effort to take responsibility, while others remained skeptical, waiting to see if his words would translate into real action. Many still boycotted the restaurant, unwilling to return until they saw proof of lasting change. News outlets had continued to cover the fallout, with some even framing Peter as an example of a business owner trying to redeem himself after a major scandal. The narrative of redemption was appealing, but it was clear that the public wasn't going to forgive so easily. In the weeks following the incident, Peter worked tirelessly to implement the changes he had promised. He had hired a diversity and inclusion consulting firm to work with both himself and the entire staff. The process was uncomfortable at times, forcing Peter to confront his own deeply ingrained biases. The consultants conducted workshops that delved into the root causes of discrimination, focusing on empathy, respect, and understanding. Peter found himself in sessions where he had to listen, really listen, to the experiences of people like Jonathan Carter, people whose stories he had ignored or dismissed for so long. One such session had a profound impact on him. It was led by a woman named Alicia, a respected consultant who had spent years advocating for racial equity in the workplace. Alicia had a calm but commanding presence, and her words were sharp, cutting through Peter's defenses with ease. Racism, Alicia had said in one session, her eyes scanning the room, isn't always about open hatred or violent actions. Often, it's about power, about who has it and who doesn't. And more often than not, those in power are blind to the ways their actions, their words, and even their silence contribute to the harm others experience. You can't fix what you refuse to see. Peter had sat quietly during the session, absorbing her words. It was true. He had been blind to the ways his own prejudices had shaped his actions. He had thought of himself as a successful businessman, someone who had earned his place at the top. But in reality, his arrogance had clouded his judgment, making him feel entitled to look down on others without consequence. He had built walls around himself, walls of privilege and power. And it wasn't until those walls had crumbled that he began to see the truth. As the days turned into weeks, Peter worked closely with his staff to foster an environment of respect and inclusion. He had personally apologized to every employee who had witnessed his behavior that day, listening to their concerns and committing to earning back their trust. Maria, his long-serving maitre d', had taken a leading role in helping to reshape the culture at La Finesse. She had always been a pillar of stability, and now, with her guidance, Peter found a new sense of purpose in rebuilding his restaurant, not as a monument to his own ego, but as a place where everyone, from the patrons to the staff, felt valued and respected. One of the most difficult steps in his journey came when Peter decided to reach out to Jonathan Carter personally. After the public apology, Jonathan had remained quiet, refusing to engage with the media frenzy surrounding the incident. He had always been a private man, and Peter knew that a simple apology, no matter how public, would never be enough to make up for the way he had treated Jonathan. Peter needed to do more. He needed to face Jonathan, man to man, and acknowledge the harm he had caused. It took weeks of back-and-forth communication through intermediaries before Jonathan agreed to meet with Peter. The meeting was set at a neutral location, a small cafe outside the city, far from the grandeur of La Finesse. Peter arrived early, his nerves frayed. He had rehearsed what he wanted to say 100 times in his head, but now that the moment had come, he felt completely unprepared. When Jonathan walked through the door, Peter was struck once again by his quiet dignity. Jonathan wasn't a man who commanded attention through force of personality. Instead, it was his calm presence that spoke volumes. He was a man who had earned respect not by demanding it, but by embodying it. They sat across from each other at a small table by the window. The cafe was quiet, with only a few patrons scattered throughout. Peter cleared his throat, his palms sweaty as he tried to find the right words to start. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Peter began, his voice unsteady. Jonathan nodded but remained silent, waiting for Peter to continue. "I know that an apology won't undo what I said or how I treated you," Peter said, his eyes fixed on Jonathan's. "I've spent the last few weeks thinking about that day, about how I let my anger, my arrogance, and my prejudices take over. I've been working on changing, on understanding where I went wrong. But I also know that it's not enough to just say I'm sorry." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, studying Peter for a long moment before speaking. "Words are important, Peter," he said quietly. "But you're right. Actions matter more. It's not about making amends just to ease your own conscience. It's about recognizing the harm you've done and doing the work to make things right, not just for me, but for everyone affected by your actions." Peter nodded slowly, feeling the weight of Jonathan's words settle over him. "I've been working with diversity consultants," he explained, "and we're implementing new training programs for the staff at La Finis. I want to make sure that what happened that day never happens again. Not to you, not to anyone." Jonathan remained quiet, his expression unreadable. Peter could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken question hanging between them. Was this enough? Was this real? "I know I can't ask for forgiveness," Peter continued, his voice soft. "But I do want you to know that I'm committed to changing. I'm committed to being better, to making La Finis a place where everyone feels welcome, regardless of who they are." For a long moment, Jonathan said nothing. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable, but Peter resisted the urge to fill it with more words. He had said his piece, and now it was up to Jonathan to decide how to respond. Finally, Jonathan leaned forward, his eyes locked on Peter's. "Peter," he said, his voice calm but firm, "change isn't about what you say in the moment. It's about what you do every day. It's about how you treat people, how you build trust, and how you take responsibility for the power you hold. I'm not here to give you absolution. That's something you'll have to earn over time, not just from me, but from the people you've let down." Peter nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle deep within him. "I understand," he said quietly, "and I'll do the work." Jonathan regarded Peter for a moment longer, then nodded. "I hope you do, Peter. Because this isn't just about saving your restaurant. It's about saving yourself." The conversation ended there, with no grand declarations of forgiveness, no handshakes or reconciliations. Jonathan stood up, nodded once more, and left the cafe, leaving Peter alone with his thoughts. It wasn't the closure Peter had hoped for, but it was exactly what he needed, an understanding that redemption wasn't a moment, but a process, a long, difficult process. Back at La Finis, things slowly began to improve. The diversity training programs continued, and Peter made it a point to be more involved with his staff, listening to their concerns, understanding their needs, and working to create a more inclusive environment. Maria, ever the pillar of strength, had become a key figure in leading these efforts, and Peter trusted her judgment more than ever. Customers, too, began to trickle back in. It wasn't the rush of reservations that La Finis once enjoyed, but it was a start. Word of Peter's efforts to change had spread, and while some remained skeptical, others were willing to give the restaurant another chance. The food critics, once eager to tear him down, had softened their tone, acknowledging that Peter was at least making an effort to correct his mistakes. One evening, weeks after the incident, a familiar face appeared in the restaurant. Jonathan Carter. He entered quietly, not drawing attention to himself, but Peter saw him immediately. Jonathan didn't come as a guest of honor or to make a statement. He simply sat at a table, ordered his meal, and dined quietly. For Peter, it was a moment of profound significance. Jonathan's presence was a reminder that while forgiveness might not come easily, respect could be rebuilt through consistent action. The road to redemption was long, But Peter was finally on it, step by difficult step. As the months went on, La Finis slowly regained its footing. It wasn't just the food or the ambience that brought people back. It was the sense that the restaurant had changed, that it had become more than just a place for the elite. It had become a place where everyone, no matter who they were, felt welcome. And for Peter Marshall, that was the greatest success of all.